Hello BookTube, it's Ben here from the History Fair channel again. Coming up with a slightly different video today. Today's video is about, or it's called, my top 20 books of all time. And that's kind of all my top 20 top books that I've kind of been reading for the last sort of 10 years or so. Things that have got me into history, something I've found of interest, something I really enjoy, and these are the top 20 books that I'll easily go back to reading, and I'll read numerous times, and I would just highly recommend them all to anybody who is interested. Now they're not all non-fiction, so you might be slightly surprised, but it's certainly my top 20 books. What I've done is I've taken images of the front covers and they will appear around here throughout the video. But I mean, I've got my chart on my laptop here, so I shall go through the chart from there, and then the image of the book will appear above my shoulder here. So let's get on. My top 20 books of all time. In at number 20, I have picked Ron Chernow's book Grant. If you haven't seen it, it's a decent thick, I think it's at least 1,000 pages long, and that's kind of with notes and bibliographies and everything like that, and it's just I personally don't think they do books in the UK like the Americans do there to celebrate their presidents and their military heroes and that sort of thing. There's just something about them that just makes them far more interesting and even exciting, if you want to say. But I'm going to say Grant is a fascinating book and probably one of the best military history books about leaders that there is out there. My one criticism was it seemed very much longer than it needed to be, and the other tiny little point was, although he used to drink a lot, that seemed to come up very regularly in the book, and I kind of thought, well, just get that out in the open near the beginning, and then we can just move on and look at the rest of Grant's career and being president and that sort of thing, and his thoughts and family. And it felt, we kept having to go back to how much he used to drink and that sort of thing. But I like Ron Chernow, fascinating writer, and he wrote about a fascinating character. So that's my top 20, number 20. Number 19 is Dorado by H.W. Brands. A very fine book about the American West and its history. Kind of covers the whole lot. He's very much looks at history from the viewpoint of a single person or a lone person, and then but also like small pockets and small families and how they encountered the American West and got through things. And when you're reading some books about American history, they could quite often concentrate on the same characters throughout the history. This one seemed different. You were able to read more about various characters throughout US history that don't get talked about, and that really appealed to me and really made the book more enjoyable. But it's the only H.W. Brands book I've read, but I'm quite interested in reading more, so I'm probably going to read a couple more by the end of the year, hopefully. That was my number 19. Number 18 is called Thunderbolts over Burma. It's a pen and sword book that looks at a pilot who originally trains during World War II as a a Spitfire pilot and ends up flying the Thunderbolt planes in the Far East. A very good book, very interesting, and there's lots of character comes out of it, and it's well written by the author, who I think, I'm trying to go back from memory, but I think there might be some sort of relationship, whether it's father and son or something like that, between the pilot and the author. I can't quite remember that at the moment. But also in the back of the book, it's got photocopies of his flying logbook, which is really interesting, and it tells you about all the journeys and missions he went on, and fully explains them all, and that really does sell the book for you. It's a really interesting read, and especially if you're into aviation or piloting or planes during any of the wars. Certainly Thunderbolts over Burma is a really good read, and I'd highly recommend that. And that comes in at number 18. And number 17, I've kind of cheated slightly in that it's 2 books, but it's more or less about the same thing, and it's by the same author. It's Lawmen of the Wild West and Outlaws of the Wild West by Terry C. Treadwell. Both published by Pen and Sword Books, but Treadwell is an author, if you know American West. He does write a lot about the outlaws and gunmen and that sort of thing, and he's written these 2 books, and it's kind of a bit like each character, whether it's in the one book, the lawman or the outlaw, each chapter is about that person, and then basically he explains almost from birth to death, however long they end up living. Each chapter is about that individual person, and it's a very good read, very informative, and because I have a big interest in the American West, that's kind of a book, those 2 books I'm going to go back to quite regularly. So that is Lawmen and Outlaws of the Wild West by Terry C. Treadwell, and that makes my number 17. Number 16 is Gettysburg by Stephen W. Sears. I haven't read that many books on Gettysburg, even though it does seem like that's the main battle of the US Civil War that gets written about. In that, you know, we see loads of books entitled Gettysburg. But this book I found really fascinating in that it was so comprehensive and detailed, and it was a bit like, as I might mention in some of the books near the top of the charts, you kind of felt you were in the situation and the battle was going on around you and that sort of thing, and you kind of feel you as you're reading along, you kind of getting hyped up and swept away in the writing and what's going on, and from that viewpoint it was a really good read. A book, considering it was a big chunky book to read and very detailed, it was certainly a quick and easy read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'd highly recommend that if you were interested in Gettysburg. That's Gettysburg by Stephen W. Sears. It has won a number of prizes, so that's certainly one I would recommend. Number 15 is a book called Boy Soldiers of the Great War, written by Richard Van Emden. And this book looks at young men during the First World War who were at the age of around 14, 15, even in some cases, I think even 11 and 12, where they would go down to the recruiting office in some sort of disguise, or kind of maybe if the recruiting officer wasn't really that bothered, they'd get swept in and they'd end up joining various regiments. And the book looks at these young men and what they had to encounter during the First World War, all the bombing, the shrapnel, the artillery, just the conditions, all the swampy trenches, all the rain, the water, and just the book looks at the hardship and asks why they wanted to come to war. And most of it was like for excitement or something to do, or they were doing their patriotic duty. And it's just a fascinating look to see at why young boys wanted to go to the war back then and what they expected and how it actually turned out. So it's a really riveting book to read, and I would especially advise anyone who's got teenage children, get them to read this book, and it's a fascinating insight. So it's number 15, Boy Soldiers of the Great War, written by Richard Van Enden. Number 14 is The Terror Raids of 1942, written by Jan Gore. During the Second World War, the Germans obviously blitzed through London for months upon end. But what always seems to get forgotten is that the Germans also blitzed various cities around the UK. And it explains obviously the cities that did get bombed and the events, the acts that were perpetrated, what happened, the amount of people that died, where they targeted, that sort of thing. And it just takes you out away from London, which is what we all tend to hear about, and it shows you the effect it had on big cities around the country. Because obviously the further away from London you didn't expect to be bombed by the Germans, so many places weren't prepared, and some were, whether they were in industrial areas and that sort of thing. But a really interesting read, and looks at blitzes away from London. That's The Terror Raids of 1942 by Jan Gore. The next book is number 13. Yes, A Guide to Victorian England by Michelle Higgs, which looks at it's like a visit. It imagines you as a time traveller and you go on holiday to Victorian England, and then it explains what you would find, what life was like living in Victorian England, all the people, the activities, the jobs you could find, that sort of thing, the activities that would go on. And it looks at crime, shopping, the way people dressed, how they lived, the dwellings they had to live in, the pickpockets and the crime. And it's just a really good read. I found it fascinating, so much so that in some of the parts of the book it felt a bit like poetry, or at least rhyming, and it was just a really good read. And as I'm fascinated by Victorian England, a really good book. And if you're interested in the 1800s, then I'm sure you would fully enjoy the book as well. And that's A Guide to Victorian England by Michelle Higgs. Very, very well worth the read. Number 12, a book I've recently read. It's called House of Tudors, A Grisly History, and it's by Mickey Mayhew. It's a really over here we have a series called, which might be in the US as well, we have a series called Horrible Histories, which is aimed at the kids, and it's like all the bad stuff and the gruesome stuff, like, how did people go to the toilet, and funny deaths and that sort of thing, and things that went wrong, and it's kind of that sort of thing, but aimed at adults. And it looks at life under the Tudors, but all the grisly and the horrible bits. So it's split into about 20 odd small chapters, and basically each chapter is about a grisly part of life in Tudor England or Tudor Britain. It's a really good read, and quite it's well written, but the sense of humour of the author comes over, and he's really good. And it's just a really good book, especially if you want to get into Tudor history. I would highly recommend that, because you can kind of delve into the book, read a couple of chapters, leave it for a week, and then go back, and it's as if you've gone back to where you originally were. It's a really good book. Right, number 11, The Great Irish Potato Famine. Now then, I've picked this one because when I was studying at university, we did Irish history, and I must admit, when the subject came up and whether you wanted to pick it or not, I was thinking, do I really want to learn about Irish history? It's bound to be just about the Troubles and the IRA and that sort of thing. But actually, one section of it was about the Irish potato famine, and it was really interesting. And this book was recommended to me by the course tutor, and it was just fascinating. I just read this book in a couple of nights, and it's really good. And I found myself, really getting into it and being really in tune with it, and it was just a fascinating read, and kind of that sparked my interest then in the rest of Irish history, and kind of, whereas that Irish history and politics seems very complicated at some points, by learning about the Irish famine kind of made sense of a lot of things. And therefore that's why I'd recommend this book, because it kind of does explain various things that you think, they were involved in that, or the reason this happened was because this party was in power, and that sort of thing. And it's a really good read. And that's The Great Irish Potato Famine, written by James Donnelly. Right, and we enter the top 10. My top 10 most top rated books. Number 10 is German Prisoners of the Great War, written by Anne Buckley. When you do you watch programs and read books about World War, they tend, when they talk about prisoners of war, you tend to think of World War II. And in this country, you tend to just think of prisoners of war being prisoners in Germany, and then German prisoner of war camps. But actually, there was a number of German prisoners who were sent back to England, and then were put in various camps around the country, which is unusual because you don't ever hear about that side of things. And this book looks at life as a German prisoner of war during the Great War. And it's a fascinating read, reading what they got up to. The book is full of cartoons and drawings that were done by the prisoners, and overall it's just a really kind of revealing read, and really interesting one. Shows you how they were entertained, how they were kind of taught new things or educated slightly and encouraged to learn and to read and do art. And it's just really good. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, reading it, and can't recommend it highly enough. And that's German Prisoners of the Great War by Anne Buckley. And number 9, quite a few of you might have read this, because it is quite a famous one, especially if you're into US Civil War history. And that's The Battle Cry of Freedom by James M. McPherson. This is one of the books I read when I was a teenager and what got me into the US Civil War. And it's just a comprehensive guide to the US Civil War. It tells you all about the battles, all the figures that were involved. There's lots of comprehensive detail. The battles, the casualties, the numbers of people that died, the thoughts of the leaders, why they did this, why they did that. And in one book, it really sold the US Civil War to me when I was a teenager, and that's kind of what got me into the US Civil War. Number 8, Hertfordshire Soldiers of the Great War by Paul Johnson and Dan Hill. Now this book looks at anyone who was connected, but mainly military, who was connected with the Great War and who came from the county of Hertfordshire, which is actually a county where my parents live, so I kind of know Hertfordshire quite well. And it's a bit like a snapshot of where you just see the lives of people from Hertfordshire, obviously, who went to the Great War, whether they were upper class, middle class, lower class, whatever. They're kind of all in this book, and it shows you how they got into the war, what happened, whether they lived or died, whether they a success or a failure, or whether they just died, or whether they went mad, whether they needed medical help. And it's just such a detailed book and a really good read. If you come from that area, I would highly recommend reading this, because it just tells you the history of that little time slot in time of what happened to people from your area, and it's a really good read. And that's Hertfordshire Soldiers of the Great War. Number 7, Britain's Coast at War. Now I read this by Neil R. Story, and I read this book last year, and it's basically, it looks the coast all the way around Britain, and at various points stops and looks at how that part was defended, who defended it. You know, it tells you about whether there was industry on the coastline, or whether they needed defensive artillery just in case, and that sort of thing. And it was just I think partly the pictures sold it to me as well. But the history of the coastline of the UK, it was just a fascinating read. That's Britain's Coast at War, and a very good read indeed. Number 6, we're getting nearly to the top 5. Now number 6 I would probably actually place in high, because I'd forgotten about this book until this morning I remembered it. So I might actually put it up to like a 2 or a 3. But in at number 6 I've got Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, written by Giles Milton. And I have to say, I've got this on audio book as well, and it is fantastic. It's such a brilliant read. It looks at SEO, special exercise operations during World War II. It was a department that Churchill set up. He wanted it to set light to Europe. He wanted whatever schemes or tricks or specialized weapons or bombs that this department could think of. He wanted them to create it, put it into effect, and just, like I said, set Europe ablaze. And it's just a thoroughly good read. I would highly recommend this. If you're a newbie to World War II or an old sock, then get this book, have a read, and it's just brilliant. I'll happily read it. I'll constantly listen to the audio book as well, because the stories and the tales and how they set things up, what happened, some of the missions they went on were failures, some of them were huge successes, and it's just a really rivetingly good read. And it's written by Giles Milton, who's written a number of books on World War II, and it's a fantastic book. I can't recommend it any higher. So that's Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare by Giles Milton. If you can get a copy, get a copy. You won't be disappointed, I can guarantee. Number 5 is The West by an author called John E. Lewis. And this basically looks at life in the American West. And it shows you basically from about the 1800s, maybe just before as well. Basically looks at the American West, the decline of the Indian nation, the rise of the cowboys, how politics and change came along, and it's just a fantastic read. This is another book a bit like the Battle Cry of Freedom. When I was a teenager getting into history, and I particularly liked American history, Battle Cry of Freedom and this book called The West, they were the two books I really enjoyed reading, and they kind of opened up American history to me, and that's why I still do history today. I just find them really riveting, informative, and I've just learnt so much from just these two books. Number 4, Day of the Panzer by Jeff Danby, which basically looks at an American tank company from, let me guess, they were in Italy first, then they took some time off to refresh themselves, and then they kind of moved around to the south of France and kind of did the south of France's version of the D-Day, took part in that. And it's obviously all about the Panzer division, but it's a thoroughly good read. And what was a bit like the Gettysburg book, where you felt like you were in the actual mix yourself. The Day of the Panzer is very much the same. You feel a part of the action, and you've got all the tales and what the men got up to in their spare time and fighting, and it's just a really good read. I can't really say much more other than that it's a brilliant read, certainly well worth reading, and reading a number of times, because there's bits throughout it you kind of somehow miss, and then you pick up on your next read. So I would definitely recommend that, and that's my top 4. Now my number 3 book is Fighting Through to Hitler's Germany. I recommended this a couple of times on my YouTube channel, by Mark Forsdyke, and it's basically I think it's the 1st Suffolk Regiment go do training up in Scotland. They're not told what they're training for. They're then moved down to the south coast when there's whispers around that they're going to be taking part in this big event called D-Day, and then obviously they take part in D-Day, and you read all about them, you know, jumping off the landing craft into the sea. Some of them half drowning. They've got all their kit with them. Some of them take bikes with them. They've got rifles. They're trying to get to shore, and all the time they're being shelled and bombed and fired at with rifles, machine guns, and they're trying to get off the beach, find some sort of defense. And I can honestly say it's just a brilliant read, would make an excellent movie. In fact, Tom Hanks's film, Saving Private Ryan. It's in a way it's similar to that, in that, you know, the Germans are throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them, and they're managing to survive, and they manage to get past the German attack, and they're then walking into France, and they go various down roads and passing chateaus and having to tackle various groups of German soldiers along the way, and it's a thoroughly good read. One of the best books I've read. It says Fighting Through to Hitler's Germany by Mike Forsdyke. And now we come to number 2. Now number 2 might be a bit of a surprise, but it's called Blackadder, the Whole Damned Dynasty. And it's here in the UK, you might be able to see it on BBC America. But the series called Blackadder, and it's split into 4 series. One you've got, I think it follows a character during the reign of I think it was King Richard, where he plays his weird son, and then the next series is set in Elizabethan England, and then the third is in the Regency England, and then the final 4th season is set in the trenches of World War One, and it's a fantastic comedy. And now this book has the scripts from every episode, and it's just my total humour. It's what I love. It's kind of, by watching this comedy series when I was a teenager, has turned me into what I am now. My sense of humour is funny, quick-witted, sarcastic, dark humour as well, and that kind of echoes what the Blackadder series is like. And if you haven't watched it, I would seriously recommend it. It's just the best thing I've ever seen on television, bar none. If I could watch anything, I would watch that. I've reread and had to buy new copies of this book because it just ends up being all scruffed up and rough and needs replacing. This Whole Damned Dynasty, as it's called, is just brilliant, and it's all the scripts from the episodes, and I would thoroughly enjoy it. And number 1, my best book, my top 1 book of the top 20 would be, as I've mentioned before, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, written by Dee Brown. Now I know some people might try and slight Dee Brown sometimes, but this and the other 2 books I've mentioned when I was a teenager, and this is what got me into history, The West and Battle Cry of Freedom. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee just kind of blew my mind, as in just reading about what happened to America, the people of the Indian nations, is just staggering. In a way, I see it on a similar vein with the Holocaust in Germany in World War II. What was done to the Indians then was on a par, really. I don't know why it doesn't get the recognition that it should do. It's the same as the Jewish nation. But what happened to the Indian nation, just like I said, it just blew my mind. And reading this book, and I've read it numerous times since, it's just an amazing story, one that should never be repeated, and just the number 1 book I'll go to. So there you go, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is my number 1 book. that I've ever read. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed my top 20 books. It'd be interesting to hear what everyone else's top books are as well. Even if you wanted to just tell me the first top 1, 2 or 3. You're more than welcome to let me know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed my top 20, please feel free to give it a thumbs up. I'd greatly appreciate that. And I shall see you very soon for some more videos. And like I said, because I had problems with my hay fever last week and there was a lack of videos, I shall be doing more this week to make up. And hopefully my little captions have been appearing at the right time. So hopefully it's not a video that's looking muddled or out of place. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. It's been a long time, this video. And I shall see you very soon. Take care. Goodbye.